Are there things that Christians should know? Absolutely. The more you actually know instead of just believing, instead of just having faith, the better. Of course, Christian apologists don't want you to actually know anything about demonstrable reality, because that'll just get them out of power, and it'll get the believers out of the pews and out into the real world, and the collection plates will just gather dust. And that's all they're after. That's all they want. So let's see another example of this and why their takes are always so absurdly terrible. Coming up next. Today, we're going to do an Lisa Childers video. I think we've only done one of those before, and then only tangentially, but you probably remember more than I do because I'm an old man and I don't remember shit. She wants to provide 5 apologetics questions that every Christian should know the answer to, but I'm sure those answers will only be one-sided, with only the pro-Christian position represented. So I'm going to show why not only is that dishonest, but it's also not where reality lies. Then again, these people couldn't care less about reality, could they? They just really want to believe. So let's get to it.
1 Peter 3:15 says, "In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect."
And then you get people like Mike Winger making excuses, because every time Christians try to get that with the non-religious, they just get their asses handed to them. I'm sure they get tired of that, don't you? Granted, I have no problem with using the Bible against Christians. After all, they believe it. They should at least follow what it says, right? Even if most of them don't. Most of them have never even read it cover to cover. Most of them just cherry pick or just listen to the crap that comes from the pulpit, because that's really all they ever believe. They just really want to believe the stuff that sounds good to them, so that's all they pay attention to. So, assuming that Elisa's going to hold Christians accountable to 1 Peter 3:15, and I think that's a good sign, let's see how far she's willing to go with this. I don't think it's going to turn out well for her in the end, but hey, let's go see.
Every Christian is called to be prepared to make a defense for what we believe.
Sadly, it doesn't say an intelligent defense, a defense in line with reality, a defense that is actually, defensible. For far too many, it's just about spouting emotionally comforting bullshit because they just want to be happy. If you remember back to the Mike Winger video, and if you want to rewatch it, it's in his playlist, he basically said, well, maybe you just get a good feeling believing in God, or maybe you had an experience. Yeah, I'm not going to deny that something happened to you, but you can't show that God actually had anything to do with it. That's always fun when Christians offer their testimony. Ask them how they justify their beliefs that any God of any kind was actually responsible. Ask them for their evidence, because they don't have any. They can't do it, at least not without appealing to faith. But hey, give it a shot, because it's funny to watch them squirm. So I guess the only potential out that the religious have here is that the Bible isn't clear what quality the reasons have to be. If you're willing to go with pathetically stupid, almost anything will do. And that's not going to convince anybody outside of their cult, but the religious don't care about that, do they?
And the word that's used here, translated into English as defense, is the Greek word apologia. And this is where we get our English word apologetics.
And if you look up apologia, it is just a formal defense of an opinion, position, or action. It also doesn't specify that the defense has to be rational, based on evidence, logic, or reason, or be supported in any way. "Will I say so?" Yeah, but that's not a worthwhile defense, is it? But it is all the religious really have. Don't let them get away with it. Call them out on it every single step of the way. They're not going to like that much, but hey, you should do it anyhow. Heck, do what I do and make the identical claim, no matter what it is, about invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies. Make up your own fantasy critter. It really doesn't matter. If they can rely on faith, so can you, even if your faith is just ridiculing their own. They will never understand why it's a problem, because they don't care. But we want it to be true. Okay, so what? All you're doing is showing just how irrational and delusional you actually are, and your responses are only going to highlight the stupidity of their positions. They are doing themselves absolutely no favors whatsoever. Not that they care.
Apologetics just means giving a reason for what you believe. And when it comes to the realm of Christian apologetics, this can span a lot of different disciplines like science, logic, philosophy, and history.
Except you don't have any of that. There is nothing in science that points to the existence of any gods whatsoever. That's why they're not using science. They are just asserting God done it, because they really want God to have done it. That doesn't mean that God done it. Stop them right there too and point out that you can do the exact same thing. Magical leprechauns done it. You're just doing what they're doing after all. Why can't you do that? You're just making them look stupid, because that's what they are. That's all they've got going for them anyhow, right? So they don't have science. They don't have history, because the things they believe are not historically valid, especially when it comes to the supernatural. History can say absolutely nothing about that. That's the realm of science, and as we already said, they've got nothing to rely on there. Philosophy? Every single stupid philosophical argument they employ is easy to debunk because they're all fallacious and rely on premises that cannot be justified to be true. In every single one, either the premises are hopelessly fallacious or the conclusion does not arise from the premises offered. It's just a shit show. What else is new?
Christian apologetics basically has two goals. Number one, to provide reasons why Christianity is true.
And it does that very, very badly. That's the problem. Ask them for any kind of rational defense for their defense, and the whole thing will just fall apart. What they're doing is pretty much just like claiming, well, Elvis is still alive because apples are blue. I'm sorry, but apples aren't blue. I mean, there are claims that Japan grows some, but those, at least to the best of my knowledge, they're the result of genetic manipulation. And even if they were blue, that has nothing at all to do with Elvis still being alive. It's a complete non sequitur. The conclusion or statement does not logically follow from the previous argument or statement. Look at the trees, which is a very common Christian argument, proves nothing about any God. Just stapling "therefore God" on the end of it doesn't mean anything if you have not presented any evidence that God is real in the first place. That's where Christian apologetics always falls down. It comes down to, well, it sounds good to me, but that means absolutely nothing. It doesn't prove that your beliefs are true, and that's what you need to do. But they're just not interested at all, are they?
And number two, to communicate those reasons to the world.
You're doing so very, very badly. That's why Christianity is falling apart. You have not shown that your beliefs are rational or valid in any demonstrable way. In fact, you're just making shit up because it makes you happy, and that is one of the dumbest things that any human being could conceivably do, yet the religious embrace it, don't they? Sorry, you've got nothing that is going to convince anyone else, anyone outside of your cult, and that's why they're not talking to us. They're not trying to present anything to the world that would convince the world that they have any clue what the hell they're doing. They're just talking to each other because they're the only ones that take any of this bullshit seriously. And that's kind of a problem if you think about it. Too bad the religious never do.
Now, this can seem overwhelming if you've never studied apologetics before. There can be all kinds of different questions people have, skeptical claims brought against Christianity.
And that's what Christians ought to understand, but they don't. They don't want to. That's the position I found myself in way back when. I wanted to understand if Christianity was actually true. I was firmly convinced that it was, and that embarking on an in-depth investigation of the evidence would prove that I was absolutely correct, even though it didn't. That's why I'm not a Christian anymore. However, most Christians are terrified to put their faith to the test because they don't actually care if it's true. If they did, they would do exactly what I did. They'd get out there and say, how do I justify this with the best evidence and the best information that I can? They'd leave their comfort zone, they'd set aside their faith, and they would put every single aspect of their faith to the test. Then we just have a lot of atheists after that, because Christianity doesn't stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny. At least if people are willing to be honest about it, which I don't think most Christians are. Because that's not what Christianity teaches. They can't have people leaving their congregations left and right, so they tell people to just sit in the pews, listen and believe, don't ask questions, don't have doubts, and fill the collection plates every single week, because that's what religion is all about. Then, when people actually do have questions, legitimate questions, the apologists have tons of excuses for why you shouldn't actually ask any of those hard questions, because they don't want to have to get real jobs either. They take cash, credit cards, and PayPal. Have a nice day.
Today, we're going to talk through 5 basic apologetics questions that I think every Christian should be prepared to answer.
We're finally getting there, huh? Well, we'll see through 1 or 2 of them in this video, with more coming next week or so. But I want to answer these, whatever they are because I haven't seen it, in some detail, because I'm willing to bet that these are going to be terrible questions and that the religious have no actual answers. This is a problem, but it's not a problem that they are willing to admit to. I wish they would, I wish they could, and we'll see more as she gets into the questions, but I really have my doubts. I haven't seen where we're going to go yet, and I purposely didn't go look at her description just in case she listed them down there, because I want to go into this fresh and blind. So anyway, go ahead, give us the first question, and we'll see if it's a question that anybody with a brain should consider. Or they should consider it, but probably not come to the same conclusion that the religious always come to, because those answers are unsupported and stupid. So, hit us with it, Elisa. Let's see what you got.
Now, this can seem overwhelming when we see the broad spectrum of skeptical claims that's brought against Christianity, or the many questions brought about by honest seekers. So my goal today is certainly not to give an extensive answer to each one of these questions, but maybe to give the start of an answer, maybe show you a couple of ways to think about each of these questions, and then I'm going to give you resources at the end of each question so that you can learn more if it's a question that interests you.
That's a whole lot of bullshit you're spouting there, isn't it? It's also really, really common. They won't give you any actual answers. They'll just throw some stuff at the wall and hope something sticks, but they'll give you other homework to go do on your own because they've got no time to deal with that, do they? Why not? I don't know. I might not say if she was on a stage somewhere and there was a hard time limit, but this is a video on YouTube. She could take all the time in the world, but she doesn't have anything intelligent to say. She has no excuses for why she can't go into any of these questions in detail, because I don't think she really knows anything. Most of them don't. Or if she knows things, she's certainly not going to tell you that, because then again, she'd have to go out and get a real job. Of course, that puts pressure on her, and the more she talks, the more chances there are for her to be demonstrably wrong, because I don't think most apologists actually know that much, or are honest enough to say so if they do, as I said before. That's why they rely on script so often. They have no actual information, and certainly no rational defense for any of it, so they'll say a few comforting things that they know will appeal to their intended audience, and then they'll just push it off on somebody else. You know, go read this book or go listen to this sermon. And if you don't like what they're saying, well, that's not Elisa's problem, is it? She can just feign ignorance and move on to something else. She doesn't actually take the heat for any additional questions that people really ought to have. It's no wonder why I call these people idiots and liars for the Lord. It's really all they are.
So number 1, have the New Testament documents been corrupted?
That's irrelevant since you haven't proven that they were ever true in the first place. This is immediately where the religious go wrong. They just assume that their stupid books are true, without having any independent evidence to back any of it up. It doesn't matter if, from the moment that quill was set to parchment, the books never changed one bit, even though we know that they did, because if they were never actually true in the first place, if the things that the person wrote down never really happened, what the hell difference does it make? You've got to prove that part, and that's the part they're not even trying to do. This is why faith has to be the first thing out the window. Faith doesn't mean anything. If the story of Jesus isn't accurate, then it doesn't matter if the Bible has changed. It's not telling the factually correct story that actually happened in the real world. And that's what matters. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that it isn't true. I'm just saying that the burden of proof is on the side of the people who say that it is. And my book says a thing doesn't remotely get you there. You have to be able to corroborate these tales in some way other than, it's in my book. Nobody cares about your book. Do better, because you really have to.
Well, obviously, when the New Testament was being written, we didn't have a printing press, so each manuscript had to be copied by hand. And when the original documents no longer exist, scholars use a science called textual criticism to reconstruct the wording of ancient texts.
Which doesn't mean anything at all in this case. Sure, if you're trying to establish if the written work says the same thing now as it did way back when the author wrote it, you can use textual criticism and compare various copies to see if they're all saying the same thing. I mean, that's great and all, but it means absolutely nothing here. I care if the stories are actually accurate. I care if the things that they claim happened actually happened as recorded. That's what you've got to demonstrate, not just the book says the same thing now as it did when it was written, because that's irrelevant. The Homeric epics record things that we know now did happen, and a lot of things that we're pretty sure never did. The gods and goddesses aren't real and all that, at least based on the evidence that we have. Some Homer apologists could have just demanded, well, the stories are the same now as they were in the time of Homer, so they just have to be true. But they'd just get laughed off stage, wouldn't they? There's a long period of time when a giant game of telephone was going on before anybody wrote anything down about Jesus. How do you know that any real events, if there were actually real events, were accurately recorded by the Bible writers? You're going to have to prove that. So walk us through the process of how you got there with your extensive evidence to back it up, and we will evaluate your claims. Go ahead. We'll wait.
When they have a lot of manuscripts and early manuscripts, they can do this with a great deal of accuracy. The New Testament documents have more manuscripts and earlier manuscripts to support their accuracy than any work of ancient classical literature.
Which means absolutely nothing. A lot of copies of a lie is still a lie. The religious have to demonstrate that the actual historical events that they believe happened were recorded accurately and truthfully, and they simply can't do that. More than 500 million copies of Harry Potter have been sold. That doesn't prove there's a real place called Hogwarts. Nobody's trying to say that the Bible doesn't exist. Nobody denies that. We're asking if what it records is accurate and historically truthful, and that's not something for which any evidence exists, especially when you get to the supernatural claims. That's the part that you have to be able to back up, and you're not even making an effort. And that's kind of a problem, wouldn't you say?
In fact, most scholars agree that the New Testament has been copied with an unprecedented high level of accuracy. There's really just a very small percentage of variations between the manuscripts that affect the meaning of the text. And among those, there isn't one that calls into question any cardinal Christian doctrine.
But the doctrines aren't based on the actual historical accuracy. That's all taken on faith. And I'm not interested in your faith, I'm interested in your facts. Even if not one word has changed between the day the anonymous authors penned the Gospels and today, that doesn't say anything about the truth of what those original anonymous authors had to say. That's why the Bible is completely useless in coming to an accurate understanding of the actual historical events, if they were actual historical events in the first place. That's why you need independent attestation and evidentiary corroboration to the events in question, and you simply don't have any. It doesn't matter how accurately the Bible has been copied if the stories in the Bible were never true to begin with, and you simply can't show that they were. This is never going to change, but the religious don't care because they're only in this to defend their faith, not to come to actual, demonstrable, verifiable historical facts. They just really want to believe.
If you want to learn more about textual criticism and the transmission of the New Testament documents, I highly recommend a book called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism by Peter Gurry and Elijah Hickson.
Which still doesn't matter for all the reasons that I've already gone into. In fact, I've had discussions with theists on this, and they always have problems with it. They can't understand the objection that the stories in the Bible just might not be absolutely true. That's a faith position, and I don't care about your faith. I care about your facts, and they don't seem to have any. Sorry, but you need to. They don't understand that we're not interested in the Bible. We're not invested in what the Bible says like they are. Everyone has to be just like they are, remember? Because in reality, Christians don't much care about any potential real Jesus. They're only interested in the stories told in a book of mythology about him. Most of these people think Jesus was white and spoke English and stupid shit like that. Obviously, that's not true, but you'd be surprised just how many Christians I run into that are certain that it just has to be because that's what they've been raised to believe. I saw a video not too long ago, I think it was by Prophet of Zod, but don't quote me, addressing a Christian video that insisted that Jesus was actually white. Now, I've seen this kind of thing repeatedly. I don't know that it's necessarily a racist thing, although there certainly might be some of that. I think it's more just a stupidity thing. Most of what we think about Jesus comes not from the Bible, but from the Catholic Church and European culture through the Middle Ages, and people today, a lot of them anyhow, they just don't ask any of the difficult questions to realize just how little we actually know about any of it. Because they're not interested in the actual truth. They just want the comforting lie, and I find that to be tremendously sad, don't you?
You can also take an online course on textual criticism by one of the top textual critics in the world, Dr. Daniel Wallace, who's professor of New Testament Studies at DTS. I'll link to that below.
Don't listen to anyone who isn't already a Christian or anything, right? Because they might not be as biased as the religious wingnuts actually are. And of course, Elisa isn't going to get into any kind of objective truth because she doesn't care. No apologists do. They're just trying to get people to buy their books and come to their talks and put money into the collection plate because that's what this is all about. Cold, hard cash. That's why she already had her book up on screen and almost certainly will again. In fact, now that I think it's safe to look at her description, she's got her book down there too. Of course, product links are affiliate links, which means if you buy something, we'll receive a small commission. No link to any book or source that I ever provide in my descriptions ever give me any money. Not ever. I just think it's important to keep pointing out just how money-driven the religious always are, whereas I'm not. Anyway, that's where we're going to wrap it up for the week. Otherwise, we'll have to get into another question, and that's going to get way too long. She spent a long time actually getting to her questions, which is why we only got through one, and it wasn't a very good question to begin with. These religious videos are always awful, just pandering mindlessly to the faithful, because they're really after their money and not after the actual truth. Sorry, but I figure truth is its own reward. I would rather know the truth and how I got there and how I can be sure that it's actually the truth than to have any amount of money rolling in. I mean, thank you to my patrons who are on screen right now, but even if every single one of them stopped, even if I never received another red cent ever again, I'd still keep doing this because I think it's more important to understand reality than to have my hands out for anybody's money. Sadly, the religious don't think that way, do they? Anyhow, we're going to come back next week for hopefully 2 more questions. I don't know, it depends on just how terrible these things are and how much time it takes to debunk them. But we won't know until we get there, so I guess you'll have to stick around and see just how bad this all turns out. I think we know it's not going to improve because this is religion we're talking about. It's either dumb or dishonest or both. Usually it's both, because that's what it always comes down to. Are there things that Christians should know? Absolutely. Of course, they're not things that they want to know because they're just looking for comfort and they're positively terrified of the facts. However, everyone ought to know the facts and care if what they believe is in accordance with objective reality. The world would be a whole lot better place if that was true. Unfortunately, we get this coming up next. Welcome back to another question, or 2 maybe, from Elisa Childers, who, let's be honest, isn't any better than any of the other con men and shysters that we look at around here. I don't do her a lot because, well, I don't really know why. She just doesn't show up in my recommended videos very often, and judging from this video, that's probably a good thing. She seems to be riding around on the coattails of other apologists who are a lot more successful than she is, and that's not necessarily something to be proud of. Being even more crooked and stupid isn't something to which you should aspire. So let's get back to it and see what's what.
Question number 2. Is there any evidence that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened?
Nope, none at all. You've got claims in a book of mythology and stuff that people believed, but that's not evidence. Those are claims, and claims can never be evidence. Claims need to be confirmed with evidence. Things that fundamentally corroborate the claims being made, and there is none of that for Jesus at all. Now, you might say that means we have to reject a lot of things in history as unsupported. And, yeah, so what? I'm entirely fine with that. Note that I'm not saying they didn't happen. I have no reason whatsoever to think that they did. Most of history is just stories. You might like the stories, you might hate the stories, but that doesn't make the stories true. Those stories are justified, at least to some degree or another, and I apportion my beliefs to the evidence provided. And where I actually care about the story at all, which isn't a lot of the time, because most of the time I just don't, but where I actually care, I am looking for that corroboratory evidence that supports the story being told. Mostly, and I know a lot of people aren't going to like this, but mostly, history doesn't matter much at all. I'm not as concerned with how we got here as I am that we're actually here right now. And I know that pisses a lot of people off.
So, esteemed historian and New Testament scholar Gary Habermas collected over 1,400 of the most critical scholarly works written between 1975 and 2003 about the resurrection of Jesus.
And I think we all know just how little I think of Gary Habermas. His minimal facts keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. He started out with 12, I think he's down to 6 right now, and for most of it, I think it isn't actually defensible. We've talked about that around here before, but I don't care what anybody says they accept. I care what evidence they can present in support of it, and even secular scholars who say they believe that Jesus existed or was crucified or whatever, I don't give a damn about their beliefs. I care only about their evidence, and they have no more than the religious do. In fact, I don't think most of them actually take a strong belief that Jesus was real. It's a, for the sake of argument, and if I don't agree, the religious won't talk to me anymore thing. And that's not impressive either. I am consistent across the board on this. If some random scientists say, well, I believe gravity exists, I'm going to ask to see their evidence, just like I will for anything else. Now, the evidence for gravity is obvious and pretty easy to come up with, and I'd probably only do that if they took a strange position on it, but I don't accept the consensus without seeing how they got to the position rationally and evidentially. So, not at all impressed. Don't let your egos get in the way of the actual facts, which, sadly, I think an awful lot of people out there do.
These works ranged from the ultra-liberal to the far-right conservative, and he discovered that virtually every scholar agreed on several points surrounding the resurrection of Jesus.
And those points have been getting less and less and less as time has gone on. I'd love to get all those people in a room together and actually grill them for their evidence, because they don't have any. I think that would probably be fun. Not beliefs, not faith, evidence, and nothing more. You could sell it to pay-per-view, if that's even still a thing. I'm pretty sure it is, although I don't really care. Because I think the one thing that would come out of it is the fact that nobody has any actual evidence. Objective, verifiable evidence that we can all examine and determine what actually happened based on the facts and not your fifis, not your faith. There is no real way to do that with Jesus. Just because some guy existing is a mundane claim, that doesn't make it a verifiable claim. And it's the verifiability that I care about, not your intellectual laziness and your emotional biases.
Here are 4 of them. Number 1, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion.
We don't know that. No records of any Jesus being crucified actually exist. Now, sure, you can say it's a mundane claim because we know that the Romans did indeed crucify people, but that's not the claim being examined, is it? We're asking if this very specific person in history was nailed up on a cross or a stake or whatever, depends on how you look at it, and that requires verifiable evidence, not, well, it could have been. Could have been is not did. I'm asking for the did, not the could have been. I'm perfectly fine saying, I don't know, prove it to me, and that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It doesn't bother me one bit, but yeah, it bugs the hell out of a lot of people.
Number 2, that Jesus' disciples believed he rose from the dead and appeared to them and were willing to suffer and die for these beliefs.
You don't have any evidence for at least most of the disciples. I don't know that they really ever existed at all. We have no direct, demonstrable, independently verifiable evidence for any of it. And their supposed deaths are mostly just church traditions. Granted, they all died if they ever existed, but how they died, that we don't really know for sure. Now, it doesn't really matter, I suppose, if these people were real or not. There are plenty of letters by early church fathers that claim they knew or claim they saw the disciples, but that's still just a claim, and there's plenty of reasons to lie to confirm validity on their own claims, and we have no external evidence that any of it is actually true. But even if it all is, let's just give them that for a moment, that doesn't prove that Jesus was God. It proves only that they believed that Jesus was God. Belief doesn't mean truth. 19 Muslims flew planes into buildings on 9/11. Would they die for a lie? Christians would have to say yes if they were at all consistent. I'm just turning it back on them. We have pictures of Buddhist monks who light themselves on fire in protest. That's one of the more horrific deaths that you can have. Would they die for a lie? I mean, there's tons and tons and tons of cases like this. Even if the disciples of Jesus martyred themselves, that doesn't mean that their beliefs were true. People can be convinced for really, really bad reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with factual reality. So this doesn't mean a damn thing.
Number 3, that the church persecutor Paul suddenly became a Christian after having an experience that he believed was the risen Jesus.
There's that belief thing again, right? Beliefs don't matter. Now, we have no external information about Saul before his conversion. Just about everything we have is just assumption and invention. However, as I said before, none of that actually matters because beliefs are irrelevant. There's no way to verify what, if anything, actually happened. We don't have any independent accounts of the experience, even from any of his guards or companions or whatever, who wrote down, well, he just started flailing around on the ground and I saw it all happen. Nobody did that. We have to trust that Paul, as he later became known, wrote things down accurately, and I just don't trust people without external support. Sorry. This is a huge claim, and the bigger the claim, the more substantial the evidence to support it has to be. And we have none. Color me not at all impressed.
Number 4, the brother of Jesus and famously skeptical James was suddenly converted after he believed he had seen the risen Jesus.
Which still doesn't prove it happened. These same objections apply here. I'm not interested in what people believe. I'm interested in what you can independently and objectively prove is true. And in none of these cases can you back up any of it independently. James claiming to see Jesus means no more to me than the guy who thought he saw Elvis boarding a train on the day that he was buried. That doesn't prove that Elvis was still alive, any more than any believed experiences prove that Jesus came back from the dead. People make mistakes. People lie. People have hallucinations. That's why we can't just trust the word of people who said they saw a thing when it comes to these big ticket items. We need more, and there simply isn't any.
Habermas also noted that somewhere around 75% of scholars also agree that Jesus' tomb was found empty.
That's a story. Now, how would you verify that? If the tomb is empty, how do you know that it actually belonged to Jesus once upon a time? This is more church tradition, backed up by absolutely nothing but blind faith. It's not like we have a verifiable inscription. Here lies Jesus, the Son of God. You'd need something like that to back it up, and you'd actually need more to back up that inscription, since anybody can just invent things out of whole cloth, just like they did with the Shroud of Turin. You need solid, verifiable evidence for this stuff, and you just don't have any. So, no, I'm not impressed.
The best explanation of these minimal facts is that Jesus was, in fact, resurrected from the dead.
Not remotely close. That's just jumping to the conclusion that you really wish was true without having any evidence to back you up. I don't care what you wish. I care what you can demonstrate, and you can't demonstrate a damn thing. This is why we have problems. But it says so in a book that I like. That doesn't mean anything. I'm not interested in your feelings. I'm interested in your facts. If someone really liked the idea that Abraham Lincoln was a vampire hunter, That doesn't make it true. That's why we need more than your faith and your fee-fees. Because people are far too willing to leap to unsupported conclusions for things that they are emotionally invested in. But that doesn't make any of it true, and it's the truth that actually matters.
If you want to learn more about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I recommend a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Michael Licona and Gary Habermas.
Two people who have both signed statements of faith that require them to agree with everything it says in the Bible, otherwise they lose their jobs. Yeah, that's not exactly impressive, is it? People who actually care about the truth don't sign binding agreements not to say anything else. So fuck both of those idiots. I have no interest in either one. And I've read that book. I just went looking for it on my bookshelves, but I can't find it. I don't know where it went. It's probably in a box someplace. We just put in a nice new tankless water heater because the old one broke. And we had to box up a whole bunch of stuff to get it out of the way so they could install the new one. So things are kind of in a little bit of disarray at the moment. Sorry. But I was not impressed when I read it. It spent the whole thing from, at least what I remember anyhow, starting with the preconception that everything they believed was true, and then cherry-picking evidence that got them where they wanted to go. Maybe I'll just have to hunt around and read through it again. I don't know. It's got to be here someplace. Assuming I can ever find it again, or have time to do so, which is in pretty short supply, so whatever.
If you want to go a little deeper, you can pick up N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. This brings us to question number 3. Has science disproved God?
Science doesn't have to. This is a point that I've made to the religious all the time. It's not our job to prove you wrong. It's your job to prove yourself right. The burden of proof is entirely on your shoulders. And as we all know, they're not even trying to demonstrate anything rationally or evidentially. It's not our job to prove anything. It's yours. Maybe get to work. Granted, they won't because they can't, because they've got absolutely nothing but fee-fees and faith. The second any of the theists who show up in the comments hear that I don't care about their emotions, they tend to get mad. And this is a pretty consistent thing. But I like it doesn't mean a damn thing. You have to do better than that. You have to be able to prove it, not just like it. At least try.
Scientists study the material world, and by definition, God is not material.
That's the problem right there. You have no way of actually knowing what God is like because you have no means whatsoever to study your God objectively and independently. The only way to determine what something is like is by having that thing available for examination. Otherwise, whatever you come up with in your head is just made up. You can't say that your God is immaterial if you can't prove that your God is immaterial. How do you prove that your God is immaterial without having your God here to look at and see what it's actually like? Just because you really like the idea, that doesn't mean your idea is true. This is why the religious make such ludicrous fools of themselves all the time, because this is kind of how they are. You don't just get to define reality into existence. You have to be able to study it and then describe what it is that you see. And the religious, they don't see anything. That's the whole problem. They are just imagining how they really wish their gods were, but that doesn't mean anything because they don't know what they're actually like. They don't know if they're actually real. How do you know that your God is immaterial? What evidence can you present to show that that's actually true? And the answer, of course, is that they've got nothing but wishes and dreams, and that's why these people are such pathetic, laughable idiots. They really are that dumb.
In fact, the statement, God does not exist, is not actually a statement of science. It's a philosophical statement. It can't be proven in a lab.
You're not going to find an awful lot of atheists saying that, are you? You will find a ton of theists saying exactly the opposite, though. This is just misusing philosophy, which is why it's so useless for anything that is supposedly real. It's great for concepts. It's crap for actual things. That's why I, at least, say I don't believe in your God, or more properly, I don't have a good reason to believe that your God is real. I don't make positive statements that I can't back up with objective evidence, and neither should they. Neither should anyone. But they are so completely deluded that they don't understand where it is that they're going wrong. Of course, trying to explain where they're in error, that doesn't go anywhere either, does it? Because they just don't care. That's the problem. They just don't care. I'm trying to deal with objective reality. I am trying to understand to the best of my ability what is actually going on, what is out there outside of my head. They aren't trying to do that at all. They use God like a security blanket. They only care about feeling good, whereas I care about being objectively correct, at least as much as I can be. We are not even talking the same language, and we're certainly not after the same goals. Atheists, by and large at least in a lot of things, at least in some things, are rational, and the religious simply are not.
So in order for scientists to assert that God does not exist, they have to filter their evidence through the philosophical lens of materialism.
Scientists don't say that. I've never seen a single scientist ever say that. So this, like most other things that come out of the mouths of the religious, is just a lie. Big surprise there. But this whole materialism thing is just another dodge used by the terminally deluded. We don't assume that the material is all that exists. We just have no evidence for anything else, and we go where the evidence leads. We can prove the material is there with a couple of obvious caveats, and the religious are just pulling their beliefs out of their asses, no evidence provided at all. One is rational, the other is not. That's why they have to keep pretending that we, the rational non-religious, have just as much faith as they do, but that's simply not true. We have no faith at all. We have no need for any faith at all. We are not making any non-verifiable claims like they are. We simply report what we see, and they report what makes them happy, what they can produce no evidence for in any way, shape, or form, and that is just dumb. Tell me which side you think is most worthwhile down in the comments, because I'll be really, really surprised if the religious side gets even a single vote.
Which excludes the possibility of anything outside the material realm.
No, it doesn't. Another lie on the part of the religious. This is why they have to cast it the way that they do. They are trying to project their faith onto others when that is simply not the case. We are perfectly willing to accept the supernatural the moment that the religious can properly define it and show that it actually exists in some objective way. And they're not even trying to do that, are they? How did they get there? Who the hell knows? They just really like the idea, but that doesn't show that it's actually there. They are the ones making the claims. It rests, therefore, entirely on their shoulders to back it up, and as I keep saying, they're not even trying to do that. They just assume that it's just gotta be there because, well, their book says a thing. Well, it sounds good to me. But those are not rational ways of evaluating reality, are they? They're just not. You can't just play make-believe and say, see, I was right all along, if you can't produce any objectively verifiable evidence whatsoever that you were actually factually correct. This is just the mind poison that is faith. Faith doesn't get you anywhere demonstrable. It doesn't get you anywhere useful. It just eats at your brain until it's just dribbling out your ears. This is just wishful thinking through and through. Yet, what else do they actually have? Nothing. Nothing at all. That's why they look like such ridiculous dumbasses. Because they are.
Frank Turek offers this illustration in his book, Stealing from God.
And Frank Turek is just an idiot. Frank is a con man, just like all the other apologists are. At least, I've never seen one that wasn't, at least not one that was popular. It's always people with their hands out for your money, lying for the Lord because they've got nothing else of substance to do. If you look at the fast-talking conmen in any other field and compare them head-to-head to people like Frank Turek or William Lane Craig or people like that, they all look pretty much identical, don't they? No evidence, lots of claims, lots of emotional rhetoric meant to appeal to people's feelings, nothing of any real substance to back it up, just, you have to believe and give me your money. So, offering up Frank Turek as a representative, that's not going to help your case, Elisa. It just makes you look just as dumb and dishonest as he is. And that's not exactly a surprise either, is it?
Quote, to say that a scientist can disprove the existence of God is like saying a mechanic can disprove the existence of Henry Ford. It doesn't follow.
Except Henry Ford demonstrably existed. We've got pictures of the guy. You have not established that with any gods. So you've got the lie that scientists are trying to disprove God, which is simply not true. And then one of the worst examples I can think of, since Henry Ford left behind tons of evidence for his own existence. What has God demonstrably left behind? And I mean, realistically, with something that you can show, not just what you really wish was true. Absolutely nothing. This is why these people look so stupid. Anybody with two brain cells to rub together ought to be able to see the inherent failure in the analogy, but this is the religious we're talking about, and they're not all that interested in the actual facts, are they? They just really want to believe. Really wanting to believe doesn't get you to demonstrable truth, though. And since they aren't remotely interested in anything but their own emotional comfort and their own wishes and dreams and their own blind faith, we're left with no other alternative than to call these people what they actually seem to be. Complete idiots, immature children who refuse to grow up, clueless morons. Take your pick. This is not going to change until they have something of substance to say, and something demonstrable to back it up. But I wouldn't be holding my breath on any of that, would you?
If you want to learn more about this question, I recommend a book called Has Science Buried God by John Lennox.
Another demonstrable moron. Come on, Elisa. You have to be able to up your game. Now, maybe this would appeal to people who don't have the experience that we've got around here, dealing with these clueless liars day after day after day. But we do, and we've got to go with what we know, right? I hope Lennox is a better mathematician than he is a critical thinker, because otherwise, well, I guess we know why he's doing apologetics now, right? It's like wondering why that lying sack of excrement J. Warner Wallace isn't still a crime scene investigator. Because he's shit, and apologetics doesn't require any great mental faculties, just a decent stage presence and a lack of intellectual integrity and the ability to just lie to people for a buck. And maybe that explains a lot, doesn't it?
You can also check out reasons.org and discovery.org.
Two crap websites aimed at the terminally gullible that lie constantly because they don't care about the truth. This is not at all impressive, sorry. Then again, it wasn't really meant to be, was it? It's not meant to appeal to the non-religious thinker. They don't want people who think. They want people who feel. And sorry, that kind of thing is largely going away in the modern world. Not enough, granted, but at least it's driving religion out of business, and that is certainly a good thing. To be really honest, I thought we'd get farther this time. This third question was the shortest of the bunch, and I guess, thanks to whoever puts up Elisa Childers' videos for marketing, each question is clearly in the timeline, so I could see exactly what we were getting into. But it wound up being one of the dumbest questions so far, and therefore I had a lot to respond to. I'm also trying not to cut in the middle of questions, and the next two questions are both pretty long, so I guess we're going to have to see just how that goes. I had planned on wrapping this up in 3, but I think it's probably going to go 4. Blame it on the utter stupidity of the religious and their empty claims and lack of honesty, because they really ought to know better, shouldn't they? All of them should. Too bad none of them do, though, or at least that none of them are honest enough to admit it. Seriously, I couldn't go out there and just lie to people for a living, and if these people really believe it, which I figure at least some of them actually do, then I couldn't be as stupid as they are if I tried. So we'll pick this up again with question 4 next week, but I don't think it's going to be any more intelligent, but I guess we'll have to see. These are not things that Christians should know. Christians ought to know better. Christians shouldn't be so easily misled. The fact that they are, that just proves just how dumb Christians and Christianity really are. And that's hardly a surprise to anyone with a brain, is it? Are there things that Christians should know about apologetics? Absolutely. Will the apologists ever tell the truth about those things? Signs point to no. But we can't really expect them to, because these people exist to lie for the Lord and keep butts in pews and money in collection plates, because that's the whole reason they're there, isn't it? These people aren't remotely interested in telling the truth. So let's get back to it. Today, we get to Elisa Childers' 4th point that Christians ought to know, and it's a doozy. This one is going to take some time. It's also the longest point she presents, so we ought to give it the effort that it requires, and that's going to mean some changes. We'll actually get to that one at the end, but today she's going to address slavery in the Bible, and then she's going to make all the standard apologetic excuses for why it's really okay to keep slaves. And we're going to debunk every single last one of them, because this is all just a load of BS. Strap in, because this is going to get interesting.
Question number 4. Does the Bible condone slavery?
Absolutely. In fact, Dan McClellan just did a video on this, and I'll link to it down in the description because I think that goes into some interesting detail. There is no question that the Bible condones slavery. There is not one word anywhere in the Bible that condemns, outlaws, or declares the owning of another human being as property as wrong, morally, ethically, or legally. This is a lost issue for the religious, but they don't care. They just really want to believe it, and they're just afraid to admit that if they said, well, it's really not a good thing, then they might not be the kind of good Christians they want to think they are. But this undeniable fact just proves that their claims of an objective universal moral standard are just nonsense. It doesn't exist. Their own stupid book proves it. This brings up a couple of different options. First, that God was wrong, since they believe that God inspired everything in the Bible. God said who to enslave, where to buy your slaves, how to treat your slaves, and how to fool your Hebrew slaves into becoming hereditary property that you can pass down to your children. So if slavery is wrong, then God fucked up. Another possibility is that they are wrong. Slavery isn't actually wrong. Modern-day Christians, by and large, think slavery is wrong. But if God said it, well, it's just got to be true, right? There are actually small pockets of Christians out there who think slavery in the modern world is A-okay. Because God said so, right? And morals never change, so it's still got to be fine. These people don't tend to be very vocal, but they're out there. They really are. I've seen them with my own eyes. They'd have slaves in a heartbeat if they thought they could get away with it. They'd also have concubines. A lot of these people would be incels if their religion didn't bullshit women into falling for their God-commanded obedience to men. So these aren't really people we should be looking up to, you know?
When Americans hear the word slave, we think of the abuse and forced labor of African Americans in the antebellum South,
which was pretty much only pushed by Southern Christians, using the Bible as justification. Now, yes, there were other reasons that don't really get talked about. They needed a cheap workforce that would go out into the fields and gather their cotton and whatever, and who better than slaves who didn't have a choice? Keep in mind that didn't mean just black people who were enslaved in some fashion. Native North Americans, and even in rare circumstances some white slaves, they were out there in the fields too. There were also those groups that were pretty much treated like slaves, even though they were never legally anyone's property. None of that really matters though, because at least today, at least mostly, the idea of slavery is considered reprehensible. It was an odd situation where you had one group of Christians using the Bible to justify owning slaves, and other groups of Christians also using the Bible to decry it. It just shows that the Bible can be used to support just about anything, depending on how you cherry pick it. We've been saying that one forever, right?
But when we look to the Old Testament system that God instituted, the Hebrew word ebed, which is often translated as slave in English, did not carry the same negative connotation it does in our modern context.
And this is just Elisa trying to make excuses. Big surprise there. Because in every way that mattered, these were slaves. They were not indentured servants, which I'm sure she'll bring up sometime down the road, but these were generally not Hebrews. They did not get to be let go every couple of years. They were lifelong property that you could pass down to your children who would never, ever, ever be set free. Of course, they try to blur that line between actual slaves and indentured servants, who are people paying off a debt because they are desperate to find some way not to have to admit that God was evil. This is bald rationalization, and we all know just how useless that is. It's also blatantly dishonest, but as we know, these people don't actually know their Bibles or their history. They just know enough to be dangerous and not enough to be honest or credible. So no, this just isn't going to fly. This is just more lying for the Lord so your followers don't feel bad. Well, fuck you, Elisa. Just fuck you.
So in ancient Israel, this type of servanthood was a system in which a destitute person could voluntarily work to pay off a debt.
See? What'd I tell you? You can read these people like a book. But that's not really how this worked. The Bible very specifically tells the ancient Hebrews where they can buy their slaves from the people around them. The people around you are not in debt to you. You don't have to buy a debtor. They already owe you money. You are able to go and purchase people as property with whom you have no pre-existing relationship. They don't owe you anything. In fact, there was a problem with the ancient Hebrews running around kidnapping people and forcing them into lifelong slavery, which the Bible tried to put a stop to, but only for other Jews. Anybody else? Yeah, go kidnap them all you want. Hell, God commanded the Israelites to keep the young virgin girls for their own uses, so that was sexual slavery. That is not at all defensible. It's not debatable. It's just not.
Although it wasn't a perfect system, they were given food and shelter, legal rights, and protection from physical mistreatment.
And because you're going to pretend that those are the only slaves that existed, you can just sweep it all under the rug. But that's not what the Bible says. The Bible is very clear where you are to buy your slaves, how to treat them, how to beat them, and that they are your property forever. These are not people just paying off a debt. This is chattel slavery, exactly the kind that most of the world has put a stop to. Except for the religious parts. Because you know who hasn't ended slavery in the modern world? Religion. Religion, especially Islam in the modern world, still keeps slaves in some places. You know who doesn't? Secular societies. So let's not play these holier-than-thou games because it just makes you all look like a bunch of hypocrites. Which, of course, you are.
After 7 years, they were released from their debt and servitude and given a generous gift of flocks and wine and grain.
Yeah, no. So here are some of the ways that you can get to be a slave. You can, as Elisa says, choose to sell himself or his child, which is downright evil right there, into slavery to pay off a debt, such as Leviticus 25:39. A court could sell a person into slavery for theft, which is found in Exodus 22:2. In those cases, after 6 years, as described in Exodus 21:2 and Deuteronomy 15:12, they are set free. Or during the Jubilee year, such that all slaves are set free. All Jewish slaves, not the other ones, just the Jews, as described in Leviticus 25:40. How they leave depends because it's described in different ways. Either they describe with nothing, described in Leviticus 21:2, they receive a financial grant as described in Deuteronomy 15:13-14, or they retake their ancestral property described in Leviticus 25:41. And that goes for male slaves only. Women can either follow the same rules as in Deuteronomy 15:12, or they are purchased permanently as wives, the aforementioned sexual slaves described in Exodus 21:7-11. However, we're talking about foreign slaves here, which are acquired by purchase. Exodus 12:44, or captured during war, such as in Deuteronomy 20:14, and are owned permanently, described in Leviticus 25:44-46. These are permanent property, except under very, very specific circumstances. A master who knocks out a slave's eye or tooth must let that slave go free. Exodus 21:26-27. If a slave is murdered, they are avenged, in big air quotes, Exodus 21:20-21. While you can make a case that these laws are intended to protect slaves, it also proves that slaves were, in fact, beaten. Exodus 21:21 says that if the slave is beaten but does not die within a day or two, then there is to be no punishment for the master, and the slave does not go free because the slave is the owner's property. Now, there's more to it, and we'll probably get there as we go on, but I just wanted to show that Elisa is just cherry-picking the Bible and lying to her audience. She's pretending the non-Hebrew slaves don't exist. She's being a complete piece of shit.
In some cases, the Israelites kept servants from surrounding nations as a result of war, but they were commanded to treat them humanely, and those servants were also protected from mistreatment under biblical law.
Well, I guess she finally got there, but honestly, if you don't die within a couple of days, you're shit out of luck. That's not protection from mistreatment. Being owned as property is mistreatment all on its own. It's not like the slaves they took from conquest signed up for any of this, right? That's chattel slavery, the stuff that she's trying to deny ever happened. She also fails to say, at least so far, since I haven't seen any more than this yet, that you can just go buy your slaves from the heathens, so it's not like these people are spoils of war. If you want a slave, you can go purchase one, and it's yours forever and ever and always. Because if you really think about it, isn't that how a lot of slaves wound up in America to begin with? You'd have the tribal wars in Africa. One group would enslave another group, and then they'd show up on the shore and sell their slaves to, well, first it was the Portuguese who dominated the transatlantic slave trade for about 130 years, and then the British took over as the primary carriers of Africans to the New World, a position that they maintained until the end of the trade in the early 19th century. So it's kind of the same thing going on, I guess, but does that make it okay? I don't know. Ask the stupid religious. I guess according to the modern day religious, it's just okay if you get your slaves from war prizes, right? Somehow I doubt you'd get Elisa to agree, but I don't think she knows how to be honest on a bet. What do you all think? Let me know down in the comments if you agree with her or not.
In fact, human trafficking was punishable by death in the Old Testament.
Wrong. This is just Elisa reading things into it that don't actually exist. There were two crimes that were punishable by death in the Old Testament. First was kidnapping humans, as described in Exodus 21:16. Second was rape, described in Deuteronomy 22:25. For the first, we've already covered it. You can buy them from other people who already took them into slavery. So, that doesn't really count. Leviticus 25:44 says, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves." If you don't kidnap them yourself, but you buy them from other people who already did, you're golden, right? Nowhere does it ever say, don't own people as property. If God can say, don't wear mixed fabrics, surely he could find a way to work in, don't own people. It seems kind of suspicious, doesn't it?
Now, the type of slavery that was sanctioned by the Roman Empire in the New Testament context was a bit different than the type of system God instituted for Israel in the Old Testament.
You notice how she's trying to run around with the goalposts, right? Because if you ask most people today, there is no kind of slavery that should ever be acceptable. It doesn't matter if you're talking about indentured servitude or chattel slavery, they are going to be against it. And that goes for most Christians too. If a Christian gets into debt to me, I don't think you're going to find a lot of them volunteering to be my slave for 7 years, do you? This is the bullshit that the religious pull. After all, they're not trying to make any kind of rational points. They're just trying to spin it so that the idiots in the pews every Sunday will nod their heads and just keep forking over their money. I don't care what the Romans did. I don't care what kind of bald rationalizations you staple onto whatever it was the Israelites did. Slavery is slavery, and it is simply not acceptable. Not now, not in the past, not ever. If your God can't say, don't own people as property, then your God is a fucking dick. Figure it out.
But it's interesting to note that nowhere in the New Testament is this type of slavery condoned. In fact, anywhere from 85 to 90% of the Roman population were slaves, and encouraging slaves to rebel against their masters would have meant execution or branding.
And it's not like you don't have an all-powerful magical man in the sky who could protect you or anything, right? That's what most Jews were looking for after all, a Messiah that would come and save them from Roman tyranny. Instead, they got a wimp, or at least that's how the story goes, that never really accomplished anything of note and then just got hung up on a tree for a weekend and that was it. Christianity is kind of a shit religion when you really think about it. This God of yours, not only is he a complete asshole for allowing it in the first place, I mean, he can tell people not to eat shellfish or wear mixed fabrics, as I said before, but he can't quite manage to tell his people to stop keeping slaves. But your excuse for all of this is just, well, the Christians might get in trouble. Well, isn't that what supposedly happened? You know, all the martyr stories. So this all just rings hollow. It's just another mindless excuse from a religion infamous for mindless excuses. What the hell else is new?
Instead, the Apostle Paul taught that slaves were on equal terms with free people in the eyes of God,
while at the same time in his letter to Philemon telling a Christian to return a runaway slave to their owner, because there's no hate like Christian love. Again, where is God in all of this? If they actually meant to free the slaves or to end slavery entirely, what the hell was God doing? Sitting on his hands? As I said at the beginning of this, there is not one word anywhere in the Bible, Old Testament or New, where the Bible clearly and unequivocally condemns slavery. Not once, not ever. Why? Because this was all written by people who saw nothing at all wrong with it. Fast forward 2,000 years, and now that modern people take issue with the idea of slavery, people like Elisa have to pick up the goalposts and go for a jog because this isn't about following what the Bible actually says. It's not about coming to an actual understanding of the Bible. It's about finding a way to spin it so that it doesn't sound so bad, so that modern Christians will keep filling the collection plates and the religious grift can continue. Anyone who tried to actually follow all the rules in the Bible as written would find themselves either insane or in prison or both. Because this is a really stupid book. Let's not pretend otherwise.
and encouraged change beginning in hearts. This radically countercultural teaching began to play out in history and would eventually inspire people like John Wesley and William Wilberforce to oppose modern slavery and support abolition.
And it took them over 1,800 years. Seriously? That's your case? That someday, sometime, somehow, someone might oppose these barbaric practices, and it's all because of Christianity, because, you say so. Are you really that stupid? I guess you are. This is just spin, and bad spin at that. I can understand why these people don't do this in front of an open general audience, because they just get booed off the stage, and for good reason. These are really, really stupid ideas, completely indefensible and hopelessly irrational, but the religious, they just don't care. They just really like the idea of the Bible and of a magical father figure in the sky who cares more about your sex life than he does about human freedom and well-being. Well, fuck your God and fuck you all for believing in this stupid asinine garbage. You are all assholes. That's just the way it is.
If you want to take a deeper look at the more problematic Bible passages regarding slavery, I recommend Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster?
And the answer, of course, is yes. Now, granted, I haven't read that book, but I did look at some reviews, especially secular reviews, and they are all, pretty much without exception, bad. One guy said that this is nothing more than ego stroking for the already devout for making the right choice, while condemning anything said by the secular community as nothing more than the flimsy arguments of the village atheist. I mean, that's kind of my reaction to these kind of things, especially in an age where most Christians are a whole lot closer to the atheist views than they are to the crap in the Bible. They're just after coddling the fifis of their followers and ensuring that their meal ticket doesn't go wandering away. That's why all of these people are just hawking their books, including Elisa here, because they're just trying to make a buck off the backs of the religiously gullible. And we've got to stop making them feel good for doing it.
I'm also going to link to a lecture from Dr. Peter Williams entitled, Does the Bible Support Slavery?
And the answer to that is absolutely yes. It does, and demonstrably so. And there is no rational case to be made otherwise. However, that's where we're going to stop for the day. I honestly just wanted to finish this video out this time, but the whole section on slavery was just too large and full of religious bullshit that I needed to spend a lot of time here and couldn't get to the last question. Sorry. Next time, though, we'll wrap this up, I promise. So anyhow, what did you think? Did she make any kind of a good case? Any points at all? And when you're done laughing at that, go ahead and leave your comments down below. This is pathetic. And it isn't just Elisa Childers who's doing it. All of them do. This is just desperation to distract people from blaming their imaginary friend, because if people start doing that, the coffers are going to run dry in short order, and they can't have that, can they? It's why what these apologists are doing isn't explaining, it's rationalizing. It's starting with a conclusion that can never, ever, ever be wrong because, just ask them. And then telling stories about how it could have been, or you should look at it this way, so that the idiots in the pews stick around for another circuit of the collection plate. No, I choose to look at it as it actually seems to be, as the book actually states it. God, or at least the people writing in God's name, clearly and obviously and undeniably allows and promotes owning human beings as property, and there isn't a single passage in the Bible anywhere that shows that to be wrong. Not one, not anywhere. So you have these con men and women making things up and saying, but they really meant this. Then they should have said that, shouldn't they? If God was responsible, he should have known just how bad this would make him look. If it was just people, and let's be honest, it was just people, then you might excuse their lack of foresight, but that still doesn't make any of it worthwhile. Christianity is evil. All religion is. This is just one more log on the pyre that shows just how terrible all of it is. Fuck Christianity and fuck anybody who believes it. You are all reprehensible human beings. You all need to be ashamed of yourselves just as much as the rest of us are ashamed of you. Will we ever find an apologist with a brain? I wouldn't be holding my breath. Certainly, we're not going to find it this time out as we wind up with Elisa Childers, and she clearly hasn't thought about any of her beliefs rationally at all. That's not exactly a surprise, though, is it? Because the religious, they just don't care. So let's watch the fail once again as I take apart her last claim, because it's honestly not difficult at all. Welcome to the last part of Elisa Childers' video, I promise, where she goes entirely off the rails once again. She, like virtually all apologists, doesn't understand the difference between fact and faith. They live so completely within a theological bubble that they just can't see the real world outside of it anymore, and that's kind of the problem. That's why this is all so painfully simple to take apart, because they're terrified to do anything but blindly believe. They couldn't care less about the facts. They can't be bothered to check their own work. So let's wrap this one up in a bow, because this is painfully, absurdly, verifiably dumb. But what else is new, right?
This brings us to question number 5. Is there any evidence outside the Bible that Jesus actually existed?
That's easy. No, there is not. Now, I'm sure she's going to trot out the same old tired, empty claims that the religious always do, and we'll just debunk those once again, because these people aren't interested in actual truth. They don't care about verifiable truth. They are only after having their preconceived notions confirmed, even if that confirmation is complete nonsense. So be ready, because we're going to go through all of this again. Before we get there, though, what do you think of her 5 things Christians should know? I mean, her explanations are crap. We expected that going in. But what of the questions themselves? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, because I'm really curious. Really, what more can they do since Christianity is wholly intellectually bankrupt? But then again, let's get back to Elisa to see her go through the motions once again.
So this claim tends to make the rounds on social media from time to time, but the answer is really quite simple.
No, as I said. Yes, it is quite easy and simple to back up. You've got nothing. This is why apologists really are just apologizing for the failure of their own religion and trying desperately to throw anything they can find at the wall, anything at all, that sounds remotely good enough to the ardent believers that they'll just dump the contents of their wallets into the collection plate and go home satisfied. That's what this is all about, after all. That's why I am really not much of a fan of secular scholars who play this sure, why the hell not game on the question of Jesus. I guess it's easier on them, both because they don't have to do any of the hard work to evaluate the claims, and they get the religious to talk to them, and therefore they get to make money, and that makes it possible to make a living at this. But it isn't all that intellectually honest, at least in my opinion, and it's the honesty and the truth that really ought to matter. It's really a shame that for so many people, it simply doesn't.
There are 10 non-Christian sources that mention Jesus as an actual person within 150 years of his life.
Which means nothing at all, because none of those sources lived when Jesus did. None were direct eyewitnesses to anything at all, and all of them were just repeating stories. Just stories told to them by the believers who just wanted it to be true. But that doesn't make any of it true, does it? It's like citing news stories about Elvis sightings. Well, this guy said he saw Elvis after he died. Okay, so what? Did you do anything more than just write down what this lunatic told you? Did you go out and try to verify the stories objectively? Well, of course you didn't. I'm sure I can come up with a whole lot more than 10 news sources where that happened, but that doesn't mean that it's rational to believe that Elvis didn't die. This is why none of this is at all impressive, but let's go look at your 10, and I'll spell out why each and every single one of them fails in the examination. So back to you, Elisa. Let's see what you got.
He's mentioned by Josephus.
No, he isn't. That's an established early Christian forgery, and virtually all modern scholars acknowledge that. Now, you'd think that the religious would give up on this one by now, right? But they couldn't care less about the truth. They're saying it because it sounds good to the believers. It's why you see so many Christians out there claiming Ron Wyatt found Noah's Ark and crap like that, because they don't give a damn if it's actually true. It's just confirmation bias. It's a whole lot easier to just believe than it is to go out and try to verify any of this objectively. So that's what they do. They just believe. I might be a bit early on this. I have no idea if she has more to say on Josephus, but he wasn't even born until 37 CE, which is far too late to have ever seen an actual living Jesus. In fact, by the time Josephus was writing his Jewish Antiquities, Josephus was in his late 50s, and most of the possible eyewitnesses, they would have been dead and gone anyhow. So no, this is a completely worthless claim, not like the religious care.
Tacitus.
Good, I didn't jump the gun. She's just going to throw out names, and I'm going to explain why none of these names actually matter. Like Josephus, Tacitus was born far too late to have ever seen a real Jesus. He wasn't born until between 55-56 CE, we don't know exactly, and he gets a lot of details wrong, meaning he didn't go and check it out for himself. He just took the word of the people he was talking to. For instance, he called Pontius Pilate a procurator, which his proper title was prefect. Procurator was only really in usage in the second half of the 1st century, far too late for it to have been accurate when Jesus was supposedly around. Thus, it might have been accurate in Tacitus's day, but it certainly wasn't when the event supposedly took place. So this is another one of these complete and total bullshit claims. No surprise there.
Pliny the Younger.
Born in 61 CE, so we have the exact same problem here. His account happened in 112 CE when he wrote to Emperor Trajan asking how he should deal with people who were accused of being Christian and describing some of their practices and rituals. In fact, the actual account went like this. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses in hymn to Christ as to a god, and bound themselves by solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake in food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. But he was just describing things that he got from Christians, not any claim of the actual person of Jesus, and certainly zero evidence was offered up for anything. So this is just a whole bunch more bullshit. What the hell else is new?
Phlegon.
I'm assuming that she means this guy. So I'm just going to go with that. Like the rest, Phlegon wasn't an eyewitness. He was born sometime in the early 2nd century, although we don't know exactly when, because I don't think any of his actual books survive to this day. Certainly not the one claimed to have mentioned Jesus. Origen wrote in Against Celsus that Phlegon mentioned Jesus. Now, Phlegon, in the 13th or 14th book of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, although falling into confusion about some things which referred to Peter as if they referred to Jesus, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. Now, that doesn't mean that he ever did, especially since Origen can't even identify where it might have actually happened. That is, at best, second or third-hand information that we can't say was ever real. Supposedly, it reported on the eclipse that supposedly happened at the death of Jesus, but we've already debunked that one entirely in other videos. Phlegon, if we're to take this account seriously, he wasn't even there. He was just saying there was an eclipse and an earthquake in Bithynia and Nicaea, so nothing of any substance there whatsoever. Thales, again, far too late to have ever been an eyewitness to anything, and his works do not survive, except in tiny fragments. But Julius Africanus claims that in the third book in his History of the Mediterranean World, recorded the darkness that was claimed to have coincided with the death of Jesus. Claimed, not demonstrated. Because this is another very common thing that we see among the religious. Well, there's something I can twist to sound close enough to justification, so it's just gotta be true. But that doesn't mean anything. There being an eclipse doesn't mean Jesus died. This is why we need direct evidence, direct, demonstrable evidence, and there simply isn't any. This is all just, well, it sounds good to me, and that's worthless. For people who are desperate to believe, taking the supposed words of others and using it for their own means, that is simply not impressive. We need direct, demonstrable, verifiable evidence, and there simply is none. So this is all just a giant waste of time.
Suetonius.
Again, born in 69 CE, way too late to have seen anything for himself. Suetonius made references to early Christians and their claims about their leader in Lives of the 12 Caesars, written in 121 CE. In fact, it really only addresses things that Nero did to Christians. And nobody is doubting that Christians existed. This proves absolutely nothing in regard to an actual Jesus. Nowhere in that section does it refer to Jesus at all. There might be a reference in that section talking about Claudius, but that's highly debatable if you want to look at it. According to the text, it says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. The problem here is that Claudius was Roman emperor from 41 to 54 CE, far too late for the instigator to be Jesus. And as far as we know, Jesus never went to Rome. So that is, like all the rest, completely worthless. Lucian wrote between 165 and 176 CE, so there's no eyewitness accounts there either. He wrote a satire of Christians in his Passing of Peregrinus, the story of a philosopher sage who, at one point, becomes a leader of the Christians in order to take advantage of their gullibility. Of course, this only confirms the existence of Christians, not of Jesus. Nobody is doubting Christians. We are looking for confirmation of the actual facts regarding a very specific human being claimed in the Bible, and that does not appear here.
Celsus.
We already kind of touched on Celsus a little bit, but again, far too late to have been an eyewitness for anything at all. He wrote in the latter end of the 2nd century. Celsus was a pagan philosopher who often made fun of Christians. Not Jesus, Christians. The works no longer exist, and we only know of them because Origen wrote a huge refutation in Contra Celsum, but nowhere is this any evidence for an actual historical Jesus either. Seriously, why can't they figure this stuff out?
Marabar Serapion.
Not an eyewitness. I mean, we don't even really know when he lived, sometime between 73 CE and the 3rd century, which tells you just how little we actually know. He wrote a letter to his son in which he talks about the unjust treatment of 3 wise men, the murder of Socrates, the burning of Pythagoras, and the execution of the so-called wise king of the Jews. Jesus is not mentioned by name, and Marabar Serapion could not have witnessed anything. This is just retelling stories told by the Christians, and this is not evidence for anything. This is just storytelling. Nobody should be surprised.
And the Jewish Talmud.
Sorry, that doesn't help you either. There are a couple of possible references to Jesus, but the terminology is questionable at best, and scholars are still debating whether any of it refers to Jesus at all, or if it is just other people coming from the Tanaitic period from 70 to 200 CE. Even if it did refer to Jesus, it doesn't matter because they're just repeating stories. There is no actual historical fact here. Telling stories doesn't make it true. And this is the problem that we see throughout. There are no demonstrable, verifiable historical accounts of Jesus from people who are actually there to see it for themselves. We already understand that there was a giant game of telephone going on, but that doesn't make any of it true.
Now, this does not include the abundance of Christian historical witnesses who wrote about him, including the eyewitnesses.
Except you don't have any eyewitnesses. The Gospels were written anonymously, and there's no reason whatsoever to think that the anonymous authors ever saw anything at all. You don't copy other people if you were actually there, and the vast majority of things in the Gospels were copied from pre-existing Gospels. Mark came first, somewhere around 70 CE. Matthew came next, and remember, these are just the names that were attached to the stories, not the people who actually wrote them. But Matthew copied about 90-ish% of the verses in Mark, sometimes verbatim. Direct copies, word for word. Luke copied from both Mark and Matthew. If you want some actual numbers, Matthew copied 606 of the 661 verses of Mark, and Luke copied 380 of Mark's 661 verses, with additional bits coming from Matthew. This is what leads to the synoptic problem, that these supposed eyewitness accounts are not eyewitness accounts at all. They bear absolutely none of the hallmarks of eyewitness testimony. If you were actually there, you don't need to copy word for word from somebody else. John just went esoteric and is largely unique material, but that's because the author, or more likely the authors, whoever they happen to be, they had an entirely different take on the whole Jesus character. None of this is demonstrably eyewitness testimony, and every shred of evidence that we have, it says it's just not.
If you want to learn more about this question, I'm going to link below an interview with Dr. Gary Habermas called Undeniable Historical Evidence for the Existence of Jesus.
Oh yes, Gary Habermas's minimal facts nonsense. You know, the stuff that started out with 12 facts and is now down to 6, and will certainly go below that soon. Because there is no evidence for any of it. It's all supposition based on faith on the religious side, and, at least in my opinion, intellectual laziness and a desire to keep working on the secular side. And none of that is impressive at all. Of course, you'll get people saying, well, that's just how historians work. Yes, it is, which only proves just how irrational a lot of historians are. And I've run that past a couple of professional historians that I know, and they actually agree. Historians are just as influenced by a desire to keep working, and the information they have is all the information they have, so they're going to say, well, it's good enough for us. Yeah, there's a fair bit of faith and fifis involved there as well. It's just not impressing anybody who actually cares about the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but.
I'm also going to link to an interview on Mike Winger's YouTube page where he interviews historian Mike Licona, and that's called Real Historian Responds to Jesus Was a Myth Claims.
And we've taken out Mike Licona too. You know, the guy who, like Gary Habermas, has signed a binding statement of faith which requires him to agree publicly with everything the Bible says, or he loses his job. And in fact, Mike already faced that once, where he got fired because he dared to question something in the Bible, so he's certainly not going to do that again. So we've got Mike Winger, who's an asshole, interviewing Mike Licona, who's an asshole, and there's Gary Habermas, who's an asshole. We're not getting any actual facts here, are we? We're only getting faith and fee-fees. We're getting interpretations borne out by their desperate desire to believe. It's all spin, no substance. What the hell else is new, right?
Now, if you want a resource that talks about all of these questions, I want to recommend a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This will help you build the classical case for the truthfulness of Christianity, starting with the question, does truth exist? Moving through, does God exist? Who is God? How did he reveal himself in the world? Is the Bible the Word of God? And finally, the resurrection of Jesus.
And that book is a complete joke. Now, we've done tons of Frank Turek around here, and we've proven him to be a complete con man. I don't think we've really done a lot of Norm Geisler, at least not directly, although he has come up from time to time. And I did go looking for anything of his to address, but since Geisler died in 2019, and his official channel on YouTube, Norm Geisler International Ministries, mostly posts his sermons, and those are just way too long to go after, I'm having some problems. If you have any ideas, let me know. Now, there are shorter videos by his son, but that's not exactly what I'm looking for. So, as I said, if anyone can find a reasonable length video of Norm Geisler, say around 10 minutes or so, I don't know, a little more, a little less, whatever, with him making some worthwhile points and not just mindlessly preaching, I'd really love to see it, because he's one hole in my debunking, and I'd really rather not spend a dozen videos taking him down. There was one video I saw called 12 Points That Show Christianity is True. It's about 40 minutes long, and even though it's kind of sitting in my queue, I don't know how the hell I'm going to do that. Maybe a point-by-point refutation? I don't know. Maybe there's an article that he wrote out there somewhere. I really haven't looked yet, so if you have any better ideas, please let me know down in the comments, because he's somebody that I really, really want to go after if I can.
So I hope this video has helped equip you and give you a bit of a bird's eye view into what it might look like for you to begin to answer these basic apologetics questions as you become prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And remember to do it with gentleness and respect.
No, it just reinforced just how utterly pointless the religious actually are and how little they actually know, because they're not interested at all in the truth. They only want confirmation that all the crap that they already believe is true, even if it's not. Because it's not at all hard to blow gaping holes in all of their claims. That's just a little bit of knowledge and a couple of minutes on Google, and everything they say falls apart. This is why they don't want to read outside of their religion, because anything that falls outside of their religion isn't desperately trying to keep them happy. This is why Christianity is a con, and that goes for just about all other religions as well. They are all doing this. They really want to believe, so they read things that pander to that desire, and then they just say, "See, we were right all along." They can't just see how circular it all is because they don't care. This is why they don't want you to leave the hallowed grounds of religion and do independent research on your own. The second that you do that, everything falls apart, because reality doesn't start with the preconceptions that they hold dear. That's what did it for me. The second that I went outside the Bible and started looking at actual scholarly research, not theological claims, not wishes and dreams, not, but I have faith, but actual research, actual evidence, the whole thing just imploded into a massive irrationality, because that's what it actually is. That's why I'm not a Christian anymore. And it can work that way for you too. Care if what you believe is actually true. Not comforting, true. Because the second you do that, the second that you understand that your comfort is irrelevant to the facts, that's when you're on the rational path toward a true understanding of actual reality. That's when you're going to give up the religious bullshit. And that is a very, very good thing indeed.